There are no sirens in this case, no police tape stretched across a sidewalk, no blood on the floor, no photographs taken under harsh white light. What we are examining here begins in silence. The absence of a traditional crime scene is not an oversight. It is the defining feature. This case does not hinge on a single violent moment, a sudden act, or a clear point of impact. Instead, the harm unfolds gradually over months and years, in places so ordinary they rarely invite suspicion. Suburban living rooms, rented hotel ballrooms, conference halls filled with folding chairs and fluorescent light. This is a case without a body in the conventional sense. And yet, the damage is real, documented, and psychologically profound. The timeline stretches from the late 20th century into the present day. The setting is not a dark alley or a remote stretch of road, but middle-class America communities shaped by routine stability and quiet pressure. These are neighborhoods where people wake early, commute to work, raise children, and quietly worry about money. It is within this landscape that the story takes place. The individuals at the center of this case are not criminals, nor are they reckless thrill seekers. They are men and women looking for something practical, financial stability, autonomy, or a sense that their efforts might finally lead somewhere meaningful. Some are struggling openly. Others appear, at least from the outside, to be doing just fine. What they share is a moment of vulnerability, a point at which the promise of improvement feels not just appealing, but necessary. This is not a story about a single victim. It is about thousands spread across decades and jurisdictions whose experiences follow a strikingly consistent pattern. Losses accumulate slowly. Relationships strain quietly. Identity shifts in ways that are difficult to articulate, even to oneself. There is rarely a moment when someone can say, "This is when everything went wrong." And that is precisely why this case matters. Traditional criminal frameworks are designed to respond to discrete acts, assault, fraud, homicide. They are far less equipped to address systems that cause harm incrementally through persuasion, rather than force through expectation, rather than threat. When damage is psychological, economic, and gradual, it often remains invisible to the institutions tasked with recognizing wrongdoing. At the center of this case is not a person, but a structure. A legally operating, highly normalized, multi-level marketing organization that has existed for decades, spans more than 100 countries, and presents itself as a legitimate path to entrepreneurship. It sells real products. It operates within regulatory boundaries. It does not require secrecy, nor does it function outside the law. And yet, when examined closely, the record suggests a pattern of injury that does not fit neatly into legal definitions of crime. What we are dealing with here is not overt violence, but a system that reshapes belief, responsibility, and self-perception. A system that rarely needs to coerce because it persuades. Rarely needs to threaten because it encourages individuals to blame themselves when the promised outcomes fail to materialize. In the absence of sirens or handcuffs, it would be easy to dismiss this as merely a business story, a matter of poor choices or unrealistic expectations. But the consistency of the psychological fallout across time and geography suggests something more structural. This chapter establishes the foundation for that examination. Harm does not require violence. Some systems injure slowly, invisibly, and entirely within the boundaries of the law. When we reconstruct this case, the most important moments are not the dramatic ones. There is no sudden rupture, no visible crisis that announces the beginning of harm. What we find instead is a gradual alignment of behaviors, small, ordinary decisions that accumulate into something far more consequential. The timeline often begins with contact that feels personal and unthreatening. A message from a friend? A conversation with a coworker after hours? A relative who seems unusually enthusiastic about a new direction in life? These introductions are rarely framed as job offers. They are framed as opportunities. The emphasis is not on labor schedules or risk, but on potential what this could become. One detail appears with striking consistency. The organization itself is often unnamed or mentioned only later. Early conversations focus on outcomes rather than structure. Financial independence, flexibility, control over one's time. This avoidance does not necessarily suggest deception in a legal sense, but it does shape expectations. It keeps the listener oriented toward hope rather than evaluation. In the early phase, behavioral changes are subtle and on the surface positive. Increased optimism is common. Individuals speak with renewed confidence about the future. They adopt a new vocabulary phrases about mindset growth, and long-term vision appear where there was once practical concern. Financial stress, if mentioned at all, is reframed as temporary, a necessary phase before improvement arrives. From an investigative standpoint, certain elements of this period are well documented. Enrollment records exist. Purchases can be traced. Attendance at meetings, seminars, or conferences is often verifiable through receipts and registration logs. These data points establish a clear timeline of participation. What remains largely undocumented are the internal experiences that accompany these actions. Private conversations, moments of doubt, emotional fluctuations. The record is silent on these aspects, and we must be careful not to fill that silence with assumptions. What we can say is limited to what the behavior suggests. Psychologically, this phase appears to involve the activation of hope during a moment of vulnerability. That vulnerability varies economic pressure, dissatisfaction. With work, a desire for meaning, but it is rarely extreme at the outset. There is no evidence of immediate distress or coercion. Participation is voluntary. Enthusiasm appears genuine. Suggestibility in this context does not imply weakness. It reflects a normal human response to persuasive narratives offered at the right time. When a system presents itself as both accessible and transformative, critical evaluation often yields to emotional momentum. This is not unusual, and it is not by itself pathological. The first anomalies emerge quietly. Spending begins to exceed earnings. Purchases are justified as investments. Attendance at events increases even when tangible returns remain minimal. When losses occur, they are framed as part of a process rather than as warning signs. Commitment escalates in response to disappointment, not despite it. This pattern is particularly important. In many traditional crime cases, escalation follows success. Here, escalation follows shortfall. The more the promised outcomes fail to materialize, the more effort is applied. The logic is circular, but internally consistent. Success is always positioned just ahead, contingent on one more step, one more purchase, one more demonstration of belief. At this stage, there is still little that would trigger external concern. Friends may notice changes in priorities. Family members may express mild skepticism, but nothing appears overtly dangerous. There are no visible victims, no formal complaints, no clear violations. And yet when we look back from later outcomes, financial collapse, psychological distress, fractured relationships, these early signals take on new significance. They are not dramatic enough to demand intervention, but they are consistent enough to warrant attention. The earliest warning signs in this case are not moments of crisis. They are shifts. In language, in focus, in the way individuals begin to interpret effort failure and responsibility. Long before any collapse becomes visible, the groundwork has already been laid. The record suggests that harm does not announce itself. It begins quietly in the smallest changes to how people understand themselves and their future. By the time measurable harm begins to surface, the psychological landscape has already shifted. This phase of the case is not defined by a single decision or dramatic mistake. but by a gradual narrowing of perspective. What participants experience here is less a collapse than a slow constriction of options, of identity, of emotional range. From a clinical standpoint, many participants enter this phase under increasing financial strain. Expenses accumulate quietly: product purchases, event tickets, travel costs, materials presented as tools for growth. Income, however, remains inconsistent or minimal. The gap between effort and reward widens. What is notable is not merely the strain itself, but how it is interpreted. Identity erosion often follows. Individuals who once defined themselves through family roles, professions, or personal values begin to reorganize their sense of self around participation in the system. Language shifts again. Doubt becomes reframed as weakness. Fatigue becomes evidence of insufficient commitment. Over time, personal worth becomes increasingly tied to performance within the structure. As this internal shift occurs, external feedback begins to lose influence. Friends and family often play a predictable role. At first, there is support. Loved ones encourage ambition and express cautious optimism. As losses continue and enthusiasm intensifies, concern grows. Questions are raised. Suggestions to slow down or reassess are offered. These interventions, however, are frequently interpreted as misunderstandings. The system's narrative provides ready-made explanations. Skepticism is framed as negativity. Concern is labeled fear-based thinking. Gradually, conversations become strained. Some relationships move into open conflict. Others fade quietly as participants withdraw from voices that challenge their commitment. This isolation is rarely explicit. There is no instruction to sever ties. Instead, social distance emerges as a byproduct of differing worldviews. The participant's reality becomes increasingly aligned with the system's logic, while external perspectives feel irrelevant or threatening. The record suggests that by the time isolation is noticeable, it is already well established. At this point, it becomes useful to shift focus away from individual actors and toward the structure itself. The system does not require malicious intent to produce harm. It operates through self-reinforcing incentives. Success stories are amplified. Failure is individualized. Responsibility moves downward, while authority remains diffuse. There is no single decision-maker directing outcomes. Pressure is structural. Advancement depends on continued investment. Recognition is tied to visibility and loyalty. These mechanisms encourage persistence regardless of results. From a psychological perspective, this reduces the likelihood of exit precisely when exit would be most protective. The critical behavioral phase is marked by escalation. Spending increases despite mounting losses. Skepticism diminishes not because evidence improves, but because questioning becomes emotionally costly. Doubt threatens identity. To question the system is to question one's own judgment, time invested, and public declarations of belief. Internalization of blame becomes central. When promised outcomes fail to appear, responsibility is redirected inward. Effort was insufficient. Mindset was flawed. Commitment was incomplete. This logic preserves the integrity of the system while eroding self-trust. It also creates a powerful barrier to disengagement. Leaving no longer feels like a rational decision. It feels like an admission of personal failure. The mental health consequences of this phase are significant, though often unreported. Chronic stress is common. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, and depressive symptoms appear with increasing frequency. Some individuals describe a constant sense of pressure, an inability to rest without guilt, an ongoing fear of falling behind. In a smaller number of documented cases, the psychological toll deepens further. Reports include stress-related physical decline and episodes of suicidal ideation. These cases must be approached with caution. Correlation does not establish causation. What can be said is that prolonged financial strain, identity destabilization, and social isolation are recognized risk factors for severe mental health outcomes. Importantly, many participants do not perceive themselves as victims during this phase. They often see themselves as believers committed, disciplined, and resilient. This self-concept complicates intervention. The system does not need to silence dissent. Individuals do that work internally, filtering out information that threatens coherence. The most damaging aspect of this stage is not any single action taken. It is what quietly disappears. Questioning slows, then stops. Rest feels undeserved. Trust in one's own perceptions erodes. Decision-making becomes outsourced to the system's framework. The record suggests that harm at its deepest level is not inflicted through force or deception alone. It emerges when individuals gradually lose the ability to pause, reassess, and believe their own experience. By the time the consequences are visible from the outside, the psychological foundation has already shifted. The most damaging behavior in this case is not what participants do. It is what they stop doing, questioning, resting, and trusting their own perceptions. As this case progresses, a question inevitably emerges. Why has there been no formal reckoning? Why, despite decades of participation and countless individual losses, does this story lack a clear investigative conclusion? The answer lies not in concealment, but in absence. The record itself is fragmented. There is no centralized registry of victims. No master list of those who lost money, time, or psychological stability. Financial losses are dispersed across states, countries, and years, each instance too small, too individualized to trigger coordinated scrutiny. One person's loss appears as a poor investment decision, another's as an unfortunate business outcome. Taken separately, they rarely cross the threshold of legal concern. Emotional and psychological harm is even harder to trace. There are no standardized reports documenting stress, anxiety, or identity disruption linked to participation. Mental health consequences unfold privately, often without formal diagnosis, and almost never with explicit attribution. The record is largely silent on these dimensions, not because they did not occur, but because there was no mechanism to record them. Legal boundaries further complicate the picture. The system at the center of this case sells real products. Contracts are entered into voluntarily. Participants acknowledge terms, risks, and responsibilities. Refund policies are frequently cited as evidence of consumer protection, reinforcing the perception of legitimacy. From a legal standpoint, these elements matter. They establish compliance, not care. Criminal law is structured to respond to violations that are discrete and demonstrable. Fraud requires deception. Coercion requires force or threat. Here, neither is easily established. Promises are aspirational rather than contractual. Outcomes are framed as possibilities, not guarantees. When harm occurs, it does so without a clear breach of statute. Investigative agencies operate within these constraints. Regulatory bodies tend to focus on financial fraud, false advertising, or pyramid structures that lack genuine products. Trauma, identity erosion, and chronic stress fall outside their primary mandate. There is no single moment of criminal violation to examine, no event that definitively marks the beginning of wrongdoing. Harm accrues through repetition, not rupture. This structural limitation is compounded by social and cultural factors. Entrepreneurship is deeply valorized in American culture. Risk-taking is framed as virtuous. Failure is often interpreted as a personal shortcoming rather than a systemic issue. Within this context, those who experience loss may feel embarrassment rather than outrage. Stigma plays a powerful role. Admitting financial failure can feel like admitting incompetence. Many participants internalize blame, adopting the system's explanation that effort or mindset was insufficient. This self-blame discourages reporting. It keeps stories fragmented, shared quietly, if at all, rather than consolidated into formal complaints. For families, the silence carries its own weight. Loved ones witness deterioration, financial strain, emotional withdrawal, exhaustion, but struggle to name it. There is no official language for what has happened. No diagnosis, no charge, no verdict. Closure becomes elusive because the harm itself lacks recognition. Participants, too, are left in a state of uncertainty. They may feel damaged, but unsure whether that damage counts. Without external validation, experiences remain ambiguous. Was this exploitation, or simply a poor decision? Was the system flawed, or were they? This ambiguity is one of the most psychologically destabilizing aspects of the case. Trauma without acknowledgement tends to persist. It resists integration. The absence of accountability does not mean the absence of harm. It means the harm exists without resolution. Over time, cases like this cool, not because evidence disappears, but because it never coalesces. Each loss remains isolated. Each story remains personal. Without aggregation, there is no case to prosecute, only a pattern that remains academically visible, but legally intangible. Many cases become cold, not because the truth is hidden. They become cold because the truth does not fit the categories we have built to recognize it. The silence in the record is not accidental. It is structural. And it is precisely this silence that allows the system to continue operating unchanged while its consequences remain scattered, unnamed, and unresolved. As with many cases that do not conform to traditional definitions of crime, the final chapter offers no arrest, no trial, and no definitive resolution. What it offers instead is perspective drawn from years of study, testimony, and cautious analysis. In the decades since the events described in this case became visible to researchers and journalists, a body of secondary material has emerged. Academic studies have examined the psychological dynamics of multi-level marketing organizations and similar high-commitment systems. Survivor testimonies shared through interviews, support groups, and civil filings provide first-hand accounts of financial loss, emotional strain, and identity disruption. Psychologists have drawn comparisons between these structures and other coercive groups, noting overlaps in language control, belief reinforcement, and dependency formation. These developments help contextualize the harm. They allow us to see patterns where individual stories once appeared isolated. But they also highlight the limits of modern analysis. Data can reveal consistency, not intent. It can show us what tends to happen, but not why it happens to one person and not another. Psychological frameworks explain mechanisms how belief is sustained, how doubt is suppressed, but they do not assign moral weight. They describe processes, not guilt. What we know with reasonable confidence is that economic harm is documented. Financial records, court filings, and investigative reporting confirm that a significant number of participants lose money over time. We also know that patterns of psychological dependency are consistent across accounts. Escalating commitment, internalized blame, and resistance to external feedback appear repeatedly across cultures and generations. What we do not know is equally important. We do not know the precise moment at which each individual crossed a threshold from hope into harm. Those breaking points are deeply personal, often private, and rarely recorded. We do not know what was said in the conversations that tipped decisions one way or another, or which doubts were silenced internally rather than expressed aloud. The record is silent on these moments, and that silence must be respected. We also do not know the full human cost. Some consequences are visible: bankruptcy, divorce, career derailment. Others are diffuse and long-term: diminished self-trust, chronic stress, a lingering sense of failure that persists long after participation ends. These outcomes resist quantification. They do not fit neatly into reports or statistics, yet they shape lives in lasting ways. The absence of resolution can be unsettling, particularly for audiences accustomed to true crime narratives that end with certainty. But uncertainty is not a failure of analysis. In cases like this, it is an essential part of honesty. To examine a case without assigning guilt is not to excuse harm. It is to acknowledge complexity. Ordinary systems operating within accepted norms can produce extraordinary damage without ever violating the letter of the law. Understanding that reality requires restraint, an ability to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it prematurely. The value of this analysis lies not in naming a culprit, but in recognizing vulnerability. In seeing how economic pressure, cultural narratives, and psychological reinforcement can converge. In understanding how harm can occur without a single malicious actor. The purpose of examining a case is not always to solve it. Sometimes it is to understand how ordinary people can be harmed by ordinary systems, and to carry that understanding forward, even when no clear answer follows.